as we watch China discuss priorities for its economy, trade, diplomacy going forward, and certainly huge issues such as the environment, what are your thoughts on the specific outcomes that Africa should be watching closely this year?
So, given that China is obviously a very large economy and a very important development partner for African countries, especially when it comes to trade, finance, and investment, definitely there's a lot that we should be looking out for and that we should be thinking about. I would say there's five things. First of all, we should be thinking about and trying to look into what's happening with regards to Chinese, the Chinese economy. Last year, there was quite a lot of focus on export growth. A lot of growth was coming from exports, especially because of COVID-19. But the question is, will now, as things kind of calm down in some ways, will the appetite for going out from Chinese companies, will that investment resume rather than just focusing on with the export growth within China, manufacturing within China? So will that manufacturing continue? Second, consumer markets. Consumer markets were quite damp last year in China. So what we are hoping is that the appetite for consumer growth will resume. And that would mean that the appetite for African products might also increase. We saw increases already, but we're looking at consumer markets where we'd be able to get more value out of the African products. So that would be helpful if that does happen. So what kinds of signals will the Chinese government give to improve consumer market growth? COVID-19 policy, I also think the third one will be very important, although it's not clear whether there really will be shifts in this or not. And it's unlikely that there will be shifts announced here. But I think generally for Africans, we should be looking at this because that will impact whether Chinese people can go in and out of African countries more easily, and also students and professionals back into China. African students are still out at the moment, so it would be a great opportunity for COVID-19 policy to shift a bit, but we'll see. I think the environment is also going to be very important. Climate change targets, for instance. Is China going to shift any of those or strengthen any of its regulations with regards to climate change? It's not direct impact on African countries, but of course, what China does is better for African countries. What anybody does on climate change is better for African countries. So that should also be important. And last but not least, when you were talking about it just now, the policy on Russia, Ukraine. Again, we're not likely to see particular statements necessarily come out, but the direction of policy, for instance, food management, food price management, how China manages food security itself, that will also affect inflation and so on and supply around the world. So I think those are five things to really look out for.
Right. Now, you did allude to this before, but of course, China's fiscal and economic projections, those are pretty critical to how it's going to invest in Africa going forward. Now, last year, we saw China's target of above 6% growth in GDP. It fell short of the 8.4% predicted by analysts. This year, analysts are predicting growth targets of between 5 and 5.5%. So what are your expectations, and how do you see this impacting China's investment in Africa this year?
So as well as seeing all of those projections and seeing that growth in GDP, of course, the decent growth in GDP generally gives a positive atmosphere. But what perhaps is slightly more important is also linking that to the China-Africa policy discussions, which came out just before the end of the year in November through the China-Africa Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And in that, there was a general feeling that investment will continue, and especially investment from private companies. But as I said, the COVID-19 policy will also be key to that, because getting investments and getting new public-private partnerships, for instance, really depends on how Chinese people and investors can go out and really understand the African environment. So it's still to be seen. But I think generally, with good economic growth, certainly sets a good. And even if it's still 5 or 5.5%, that's still strong enough to see still increases in African engagement.
Well, what about trade? Because last year we saw China do pretty well on trade. We saw foreign trade exceeding the $6 trillion mark for the first time. Total bilateral trade between China and Africa climbed about 35% year on year. We also saw Africa's exports to China increasing by about 43.7% year on year. Now, given that China has had to overcome several internal crises in its path this past year, including a crash in the housing sector and, of course, the pandemic, do you expect to see a significant change to trade flows this year?
So our expectation is that trade flows will actually increase this year, even though, of course, as I was mentioning, we also would like to see a shift in terms of some of the exports that were being delivered in China also being delivered elsewhere, including in African countries. However, I think the reason the trade should shift, the actual trade balance will likely shift. In particular, if consumer markets recover this year, which with China's COVID-19 policy, and as time moves on, consumers, I think, are becoming a bit more confident. Yes, there are issues around housing and debt, but if consumers do become a bit more confident, then they will start to bring in other types of African products, not just kind of commodities and so on, which has really driven the trade to date. And then, of course, we'll continue to see exports going up from China, but still at a different pace, perhaps.
Right. Well, as you mentioned earlier, two areas that Africa should be watching closely is China's continued support in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, deepening of reforms in terms of its climate change goals. So, what resolutions then do you think we should be watching closely that could have huge or significant implications for Africa in these two areas?
Well, COVID-19 and climate change are related because they are global public challenges. And what China has said is that with regards to African countries, for instance, that it will make some quite significant commitments on vaccine production locally, as well as vaccine donations, which is going to continue to be very important. African countries still don't have enough COVID-19 vaccines. So the continued commitment of China to helping the rest of the world tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as what it does at home, which would then open up, for others to come in and out of China. That would be of significant interest. And of course, with the climate change, as I mentioned earlier, the more that China does on climate change, the more that China does is not just important in terms of the overall emissions reductions, but as we've seen, for instance, things like solar production, a number of different technologies, their costs have been brought down by China investing in these because China has the scale. So as if some of that resumes, that commitment resumes, what China does on electric vehicles, for instance, if growth in that market picks up after these policies, if there's more policies initiated on that, these will have impacts on Africa in both direct and indirect ways.